In all my years of gaming, I love titles that were filled to the brim with a great story, relatable characters, and some action-packed gameplay. But despite all that, I kept steering away from the types of games that seemed like your everyday old-school Square Enix RPG. And while I do enjoy those every now and then, I get bored pretty quickly when most of what you do is read tons of text and do turn-based combat. So for the longest time, I didn't pay too much attention to the Tales series because on the outside looking in, it looked like the standard JRPG. But recently, after playing the Xenoblade series and getting a taste of the Mana series, my eyes opened wide to the action-packed RPGs I used to think were just like the rest. And after playing today's game, I'm hyped to have yet another series full of games that I can't wait to dive deeper into. Today we're here to look at Tales of Arise, the newest entry in the series, along with the most recent DLC, Beyond the Dawn. Before I even started playing, I heard some talk about this game dividing the fan base and being a train wreck near the end. But how could that possibly be the case for a fan favorite series like this? With the action-packed gameplay and the relatable storyline, you'd think that this was a perfect next step for the series. Well, let's start off with the basics of the plot and see for ourselves. The story here is something that just about everybody will be interested in. It's a tale of the haves and the have-nots. A story of slaves fighting back against their oppressors to gain back the freedom they had stripped away from them. The Renans are these beings from another planet that have come to Dana to take away the power known as astral energy. This leads to the Danans becoming slaves that work in different ways to produce this astral energy for the Renan lords who want to collect it as part of a crown contest. And the winner of that crown contest will become the sovereign and basically gain a massive amount of power. This unfolds as we not only see the terrible things these Renans do to gather astral energy, but also how they treat the Danans like animals or worse for their personal gain. But that's just the long and boring explanation for the plot. We start off as a slave known as Iron Mask, but later unveiled as Alphen. He meets a Renan named Shion, and together they travel across Dana to defeat those Renan lords and meet even more friends along the way. Through most of this, it's really nice to get to know these party members better and get closer with them. We get introduced to them almost in pairs, as Alphen and Shion being first, then Law and Rinwell, and finally Kisara and Dohalim. Without saying too much, it's really interesting to see how they bounce off one another and handle each situation. They all end up having the same goal of liberation with totally different reasons for working together. We get to see that both through the main story, the side quests, and the skits, so there's plenty of chances to see each quirk in detail behind the teammates. But the big issue, however, is that some of that extra character building and even the world building can be drowned in a heavy amount of dialogue. And I mean, it's so much dialogue that it takes you out of the experience in a really bad way. But we'll jump a bit more into that in a moment. What I did want to cover is how little the plot seems to focus on each individual Renan lord that we end up facing. The core concept of these lords reigning over the Danans don't really go into detail about why they do these things or what their individual motivations may be. Now, we do see the ways that they do manipulate their slaves, and that gives us a look at their twisted sense of how to gain astral energy, but that's just about it. Like, we're given the knowledge that, of course, Renans are bad people who do bad things for the sake of power. But I can't point out any kind of development for most of the Renan lords doing these terrible acts. You know, besides the fact that they just want Danans to suffer. Aside from one Renan lord who we know is good, nobody else has a clear drive for why they are competing in this crown contest. Hell, I hardly remember any of the first few bosses because they didn't even stand out in a meaningful way. So when it comes to real character development, the main cast is all you have to work with, and boy, there is a lot you can get into. At random points, there's new dialogue that comes up between party members, and you can press a button to start up these panel cutscenes. These are called skits, and there's over 300 of them that you can view along your journey. There's a lot of different pieces of dialogue in here, ranging from small talk to important plot building. And I've seen some fans talk about how these start to ruin the pacing of the plot since these scenes don't naturally fall into place. Meaning that those fans who love to dig into the world building and characters will be forced to watch more than 300 cutscenes, with most of them being optional. If you're someone who wants to sink into this story and really get to know the characters, you have plenty of chances to do so. But if you're someone who's just not interested, then choosing not to watch these is going to save you a lot of time and get you back into the gameplay a bit faster. And with how much the game starts to dump plot on you closer to the end, I started to ignore these for my own mental health. So more power to everybody who can sit through them all. But what I did want to point out is one interaction that people keep talking about between Dohalim and Rinwell.
When he starts to molt, would you be willing to give me his old feathers? However, I hear pillows made from owl feathers are very comfortable and wish to make one.
This is why I hate you, Renans!
Did I say something offensive?
Now look, all Dohalim was trying to do was use the feathers that had already fallen off of Hootle to make a pillow, and Rinwell acted like he was going to pluck each feather off by hand. And I get that the whole narrative was about how bad Renans can be, but putting one of the nicest Renans in that negative light was just annoying. And hey, it sounds a little bit racist to me, Rinwell, I'm not gonna lie.
This is why I hate you niggas!
But I guess now is the best time to talk about my biggest problem with Arise. Nearing the final parts of the plot, they lay on way too much backstory and exposure out of nowhere. For most of your time, you see the effects that the Renans have on the lives of the Danans, and it makes sense. With how much they beat you over the head with the idea of revolution, you'd imagine that's what you can expect all the way through to the end, right? Nah, instead, they throw so much other stuff at you through constant skits and cutscenes that seem to come out of nowhere. And I mean that so much of this could have been spread throughout most of the plot in bits and pieces to lead up to the ending, but that just wasn't the case. In the last few hours, the plot feels so disconnected from everything else. The world becomes so much more linear than before, and you get an uneven amount of dialogue compared to the action. It felt like I was sitting through a visual novel and it just took me out of the experience. Like, I won't say that the story is bad, but the pacing is something that kills the experience the longer that you play. When they mention so many new elements at the last few hours of a 40-hour game, it comes across like everything is being rushed. There's even one part where you enter a room with like 3 NPCs in it, and for whatever reason, these 3 random characters unload a crazy amount of info just to never be relevant again. And I'm talking about pieces of lore that are major, coming from characters that are completely irrelevant. Like, if we did get some more information on the history of the Renans and their homeworld before getting too far, then it might have felt different. But the final chapters shoveling piles of lore down your throat is the worst possible way of wrapping things up. That pacing issue isn't just something I saw through the story though, since even the gameplay started to get more dependent on grinding. But we'll get into that in a little bit. Again, if the lore was dropped on us piece by piece during each chapter where we liberate the Danans, I think most fans would have been happier with things. Hell, give those Renan lords some lines that connect the dots and have them be more of a crucial plot device rather than a quick boss battle. Just be warned that things are going to slow down heavy in the last act, and it is not what I expected at all. But moving into the gameplay, there's so many different options for combat that make it easy to pick and choose how you want to play. And hey, you can even choose the auto battle option if you need to do a little bit of grinding and don't want to fight for yourself. I just don't recommend using it against bosses or stronger opponents. The AI does a really decent job at fighting, but still won't do well when it comes to dodging and using techniques at the best time. You're able to play as each of the 6 main characters, all of them having their own gimmicks and abilities that come in handy for each fight. Now personally, I chose to play as Alphen most of the time since he has some of the best combo and damage potential out of everyone, with his main drawback being that the blazing sword he can use in combos will deplete his health every time he uses it. But as long as you have some good healing, you won't need to worry about that too much. Every playable character has their own uses whether you do or don't have them on your party. One thing that normally sucks about RPGs with parties is that you're forced to make hard decisions about who will and won't be on the sidelines. But luckily, nobody gets left behind during any point of your journey. By the time you unlock Kisara and Dohalim, you'll be able to swap between who you have on your active 4-person squad, with the remaining 2 people always being available for their boost attacks and boost strikes. The boost attacks will use that character's signature technique, like Law being able to break shields and Rinwell being able to stop enemies from casting a spell. Then the boost strikes are the most flashy parts of combat. When you build up an enemy stagger gauge, you'll be able to pull off a combo attack between 2 of the party members. And my favorite has to be between Law and Shion, since the dude literally kicks flaming bullets through your opponent like a shotgun. And there's a heavy amount of variety you can make in battles since you can mix up your current teams on the fly and give them different commands. And this is a very important part of fights, especially when you reach some of the harder sections. The combat starts to get both tedious and difficult after a while, but not just for the reasons that you would expect. The CP system makes it so any and all of your magic that would heal your team is limited to the amount of cure points that you have. And it makes sense for the sake of making things more challenging, but even playing in the normal setting, it gets really annoying halfway into the game. It's a balancing act between you having enough items to restore your health and CP, but making sure the AI teammates don't waste that CP too quickly. I ran into situations where my team would faint so frequently that the healers would constantly run through CP just to revive and heal. But you can increase that CP gauge by defeating tough monsters in the overworld or just leveling up. But eventually you will be feeling the pressure of that CP gauge at some point. Side quests are pretty important if you want to keep your characters on par with the story. Plenty of those missions are short, with half of them being fetch quests that take little to no time at all. But the rewards you end up receiving, like gold and SP, end up being a game changer. Since you need SP to unlock skills for all 6 characters, you'll want to have as much as possible to build them up. And you can never have enough golden materials to help upgrade all of your weapons and buy the best armor available. I gotta say that the main story of Tales of Arise was rough nearing the end and damn near had me drowning between the heavy dialogue and increasing difficulty. I'll get into the DLC in just a moment, but there's still one thing I noticed later on that had me feeling a little bit heated. So the different types of DLC you can buy are very concerning, considering that this is just a single player RPG. Not only can you buy extra currency for $2 a piece, but you can also spend real life money on things like level ups, discounts for in-game merchants, and boosts to your CP. So while the game starts to get more expensive and oddly difficult about halfway through, I imagine that this is where they expected people to turn to instead of going through hours of grinding. Now, I'd really like to believe that wasn't the case, but with how much they redirected me back to the PlayStation Store in the pause menu, that could very well be true. If so, then that's a shady kind of microtransaction, seeing how they could have made the game harder just for this purpose. And also, some of the characters' skills are locked behind paid DLC outfits. Some of those give characters new abilities, like Law having access to a light skill through one of those DLC. And you don't need those skills to enjoy the game, but it sucks knowing that you don't have access to those without opening your wallet. But enough about that DLC, let's dig into the more important expansion, Beyond the Dawn. Spoiler warning for any of you who don't want to hear about the DLC or if you haven't played the main story until the very end. Obviously, I gotta talk about some of the endgame things, so now is your chance to turn away if you're not caught up yet. By the way, they do allow you to play this DLC by itself even if you haven't played the main story. But luckily they do tell you that this will totally spoil the ending for you, so you don't gotta worry about that. This DLC takes place after the events of the main game as we see the worlds of Dana and Rena become one. Beyond the Dawn gives us a glimpse at what life is like after the two worlds collide, and as you might expect, there's still a heavy divide between the two races. They run through the events that take place at the end, and you start off 1 year after the collision. We get to reunite with all 6 of the main characters from the main game, with the addition of a completely new character who is the focus of the entire DLC. The newest character is Nazamil, the child of both Renan and Danan descent. While we don't get to use her in battle, her existence brings some deeper meaning to the division between the races, since she's an outcast who can't fit into either. The story revolves around the concept of the two races becoming more friendly with one another and leads to some crazy stuff happening. I won't spoil too much about that part, but I do think it's a nice addition to the plot for what it's worth. Going back to that original concept of a battle between races was a good choice, seeing how much people enjoyed that in the main story. You're even given some reconstruction quests that focus on going back to other parts of Dana to help fix and rebuild each region. It was much more down to earth, especially compared to how complicated the ending of the main plot was. And unlike the main game, the pacing isn't nearly as bad here, and I didn't feel like I needed to do much grinding either. Although some of the later bosses did end up being bullet sponges that soaked up every ounce of damage I dealt, leading to fights lasting 15 minutes or more. But if you played the main game and you really enjoyed the dynamic between the 6 main characters, then this is an easy must-buy. They do a great job of expanding on their connections through different side quests. It was a cute way to wrap up some of the more loose ends from the main story, and it was nice getting to see how things ended up after a year. I don't think it needs to exist though, since it doesn't add much more than a small amount of gameplay and stories that were more like fan service. It's like one of those anime OVA movies that do take place in the universe but can easily be skipped without missing much. But what more could I expect from a DLC for an already 2-year-old game? For my very first time with the Tales series, I totally see why the fans love it so much. The focus on the characters and the overall world building were great. I could have gone without some of its later flaws of course, but it was still a fun time. And then the combat is especially what has me excited to play more of the series. Actually, I bought Tales of Berseria years ago from a PS4 holiday sale and just never touched it. So I'm hoping that ends up being a good time when I jump into that next. But hey, if you have any recommendations for any of the other Tales games, let me know in the comments cause I'm down to see what's up. And let me know your thoughts on Tales of Arise while you're at it. Subscribe for more videos just like this one and I'll see you all in the next video.